Ladies and gentlemen, there is a moment in life when a person finally wakes up, a moment when the fog clears, when the mind regains its authority, and when the soul says, enough. And many people live under emotional manipulation without even realizing it. A narcissistic individual survives on control. Their power is not built on truth, love, or character. Their power is built on attention, admiration, and emotional dependence. There comes a powerful turning point in a person's life when they finally stop feeding the ego of someone who thrives on control. For a long time, many people do not realize they are participating in a cycle that quietly drains their confidence, their peace, and sometimes even their identity. A narcissistic personality survives on emotional supply. That supply may come in the form of attention, admiration, reactions, or even arguments. As long as you are emotionally engaged, whether through love, frustration, or trying to prove your innocence, the system continues to function. But something remarkable happens the moment you stop. The moment you stop defending yourself endlessly. The moment you stop explaining things that should already be obvious. The moment you stop chasing approval that never truly comes. That moment is the true turning point. When a narcissistic individual senses that their influence over you is fading, they experience something that feels like the loss of oxygen. Their sense of control begins to weaken because the very thing that sustained it, your emotional reaction, is disappearing. For a long time, they relied on your responses. They relied on your patience, your forgiveness, your willingness to keep fixing problems that you did not create. But when a person reaches a place of clarity, something changes internally. It is not always loud. It is often very quiet. It is a decision made deep within the mind and the spirit. The decision says, I will no longer participate in my own emotional destruction. And once that decision is made, the dynamic shifts immediately. At first, the narcissist may not fully understand what has happened. They may notice that your responses are shorter. They may notice that your reactions are calmer. They may notice that the emotional intensity they once controlled is no longer present. And that confuses them. Because manipulation only works when the other person remains emotionally entangled. When you begin to detach, you remove the energy that powers their strategy. Suddenly, the arguments no longer escalate the way they used to. The guilt tactics no longer land with the same force. The accusations no longer trigger the same defensive explanations. You become calmer, and calmness is dangerous to manipulation. You see, manipulators thrive in emotional chaos. When emotions are high, logic becomes weak. When someone is constantly defending themselves, they are easier to control. But when a person becomes emotionally steady, the manipulative structure begins to collapse. This is why the narcissist begins to sense something deeply unsettling. They realize you are no longer seeking their validation, and that realization threatens the entire relationship dynamic they once controlled. For years, you may have tried to earn their approval. You may have tried to prove your loyalty, your sincerity, or your love. But narcissistic personalities rarely reward those efforts because their power depends on keeping you in a constant state of trying harder. However, the moment you stop trying to earn approval, something extraordinary happens. You reclaim authority over your own emotional life. You no longer measure your worth based on their reactions. You no longer shape your behavior just to avoid their criticism. You begin to recognize that your peace is more valuable than their approval. And that realization is the beginning of freedom. This is the turning point where the narcissist senses the shift. They begin to understand that their influence is weakening. They begin to feel that the control they once exercised over your emotions is slipping away. And when control begins to slip, panic quietly begins to rise. Because the one thing a narcissist fears most is not conflict. It is losing influence over someone who once believed in them. So the moment they realize you are done, truly done, they begin preparing their final strategies to regain control. But by that point, something inside you has already changed. You have seen the pattern. You have understood the system. And once a person understands the system of manipulation, it becomes much harder for that system to control them again. That is why the moment you stop feeding their ego is not just a small emotional decision. It is the moment you begin taking your life back. There comes a powerful turning point in human relationships when a person finally stops feeding the ego of someone who thrives on control. Many people spend years unknowingly supplying emotional energy to individuals who constantly seek admiration, validation, and attention. This emotional supply becomes the fuel that sustains a narcissistic personality. As long as they receive it, the relationship appears stable on the surface. But the moment that supply begins to dry up, the entire dynamic starts to change. The moment you stop reacting the way you used to, the moment you stop explaining yourself endlessly, the moment you stop chasing approval or trying to prove your worth, something shifts in the atmosphere. At first, it may seem subtle. The narcissist might not immediately confront the change. They may observe quietly, studying your behavior, trying to understand why their usual tactics are no longer producing the same results. This is the moment when they begin to sense that something they once controlled is slipping away. For a long time, they relied on predictable responses from you. If they criticized you, you defended yourself. If they ignored you, you chased their attention. If they blamed you, you tried to fix things. These patterns created a cycle that kept them in a position of emotional authority. But when you grow, when you begin to understand the manipulation, and when you start choosing silence instead of reaction, the entire structure begins to collapse. Your silence becomes powerful. Your calmness becomes threatening. Your detachment becomes confusing. Because control only works when someone is participating in the game. The moment you stop playing, the rules of the game no longer apply. And this is where the narcissist begins to experience a form of internal panic. They might test you. They might provoke you intentionally just to see if you will react the way you used to. They may say things designed to hurt you or challenge you, not because they are seeking resolution, but because they are trying to restore the old dynamic where they held emotional power. When those tactics fail, confusion begins to grow inside them. They start realizing that the influence they once had over your emotions is weakening. And for someone who depends on psychological control, that realization is deeply unsettling. Many people misunderstand this stage. They think the narcissist is becoming nicer or more attentive because they suddenly care. But in reality, this stage often represents an attempt to regain control through a different strategy. They may suddenly compliment you. They may become unusually supportive. They may show affection they rarely expressed before. In some cases, they may even apologize for past behavior. To an untrained mind, these gestures can look like genuine change. But when viewed carefully, they often serve a different purpose. They are not always about healing the relationship. They are about restoring access to your emotional energy. Because once they regain that access, the cycle usually begins again. This is why awareness is so important. Growth allows you to recognize the difference between authentic transformation and strategic behavior. Real change is consistent, patient, and humble. Manipulation, on the other hand, often appears suddenly and disappears just as quickly once the person regains control. When you maintain your boundaries during this stage, something remarkable happens. The narcissist begins to recognize that their influence is truly fading. The strategies that worked for years no longer produce results. Their words no longer shape your emotions. Their approval no longer determines your sense of value. And in that moment, they realize something they never expected. You are no longer under their control. That realization can trigger the most aggressive stage of the entire dynamic. Because when someone who relies on dominance begins to lose that dominance, they often respond with their most desperate tactics. One of the most common responses is the attempt to reshape the narrative. If they cannot control your mind anymore, they may attempt to control the story surrounding you. This is where smear campaigns, accusations, and distortions of truth often begin to appear. They may tell others that you changed, that you became difficult, ungrateful, or disrespectful. They may present themselves as the wounded party, carefully crafting a version of events that protects their image. This strategy serves a psychological purpose. By convincing others that you are the problem, they attempt to regain the sense of power they feel slipping away. It allows them to avoid confronting their own behavior while also maintaining social influence. However, there is an important truth hidden within this final stage. The intensity of their reaction is often a direct reflection of your growth. When you finally withdraw from manipulation, you break a pattern that may have existed for years. You disrupt a system that once gave someone control over your emotions, your attention, and sometimes even your identity. And breaking that system is not a small act. It is a powerful declaration that you have rediscovered your self-respect. The moment you stop feeding their ego is the moment you begin reclaiming your personal authority. It is the moment you move from emotional dependency to emotional independence. That transition can be uncomfortable. It can create conflict, misunderstanding, and even hostility from the person who once benefited from your compliance. But it is also the moment when your life begins to realign with your dignity, your clarity, and your inner strength. And once a person reaches that level of awareness, they are no longer easily controlled again. The turning point in dealing with a narcissistic individual begins the moment you stop feeding the system that has sustained their control for so long. Many people do not realize that narcissistic influence does not survive on love or respect. It survives on emotional supply. That supply may come in many forms: constant attention, validation, arguments, explanations, apologies, or even tears. Every reaction becomes fuel. Every emotional response reinforces the illusion that they still have authority over your mind and your decisions. But there comes a moment when something changes within you. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it happens after years of exhaustion, confusion, and emotional battles. One day you simply realize that explaining yourself repeatedly is no longer worth your peace. You recognize that defending your character to someone committed to misunderstanding you is a losing investment of energy. And in that moment, you begin to withdraw the supply. You stop arguing. You stop trying to convince them of your value. You stop chasing their approval. Instead of reacting, you become calm. Instead of defending, you become silent. Instead of engaging in emotional warfare, you begin protecting your energy. For a narcissistic personality, this shift is extremely disturbing. They may not immediately understand what is happening, but they can sense the change. Your silence becomes louder than your previous arguments. Your calmness becomes more threatening than your previous emotional responses. Because for the first time, they are facing something they cannot easily manipulate: your detachment. This is the moment when the power dynamic begins to reverse. When manipulation stops working, confusion appears. The narcissist may suddenly begin acting differently. They may appear kinder than before. They may suddenly acknowledge your feelings or promise change. They may even revisit old memories to remind you of the good times. But this behavior is often misunderstood. It is not always the result of genuine transformation. In many cases, it is the first stage of panic. When someone who relied on emotional control begins to lose their influence, they instinctively search for strategies to regain it. Sometimes they try charm. Sometimes they try guilt. Sometimes they attempt emotional bargaining. But if those strategies fail, another layer begins to emerge, one that reveals the true structure of their character. When they realize you are truly done, when they recognize that their usual tools are no longer effective, the situation enters its most revealing stage. The mask begins to slip. The personality they carefully presented to maintain influence starts to fracture. This is often when the dirtiest final move appears. One of the most common strategies is the attempt to control the narrative. If they cannot control you directly anymore, they attempt to control how others see you. They may begin sharing distorted versions of events with friends, family members, or social circles. Stories are rewritten. Situations are exaggerated. Facts are rearranged to position themselves as the injured party. This tactic is known as a smear campaign, and it serves a very specific psychological purpose. By damaging your reputation, they attempt to preserve their own image while simultaneously isolating you. If others begin questioning your character, the narcissist hopes you will feel pressured to return and defend yourself. But here is the deeper truth about this stage. The smear campaign is not a sign of their strength. It is a sign of their desperation. People who are secure in their character rarely feel the need to destroy someone else's reputation. But when identity is built on external validation, protecting that image becomes an obsession. In their mind, if others begin to see the truth about their behavior, the entire illusion collapses. So they fight to control perception. They may portray themselves as misunderstood, abandoned, or betrayed. They may remind others of your past mistakes while ignoring their own destructive patterns. They may even attempt to provoke you into reacting emotionally, hoping that your reaction will confirm the negative image they are spreading. This is why emotional discipline becomes extremely important during this stage. Your greatest strength is not winning arguments. Your greatest strength is consistency. When your behavior remains calm, respectful, and grounded, the truth eventually reveals itself over time. Character has a way of exposing deception without needing constant defense. And this is where many people make a critical discovery. The moment the narcissist reveals their dirtiest move is often the moment you finally see the entire pattern clearly. The confusion disappears. The manipulation becomes obvious. The emotional fog that once clouded your judgment begins to lift. What once felt like a complicated relationship suddenly becomes understandable. You realize that the conflict was never about solving problems together. It was about maintaining control. And once that realization becomes clear, something powerful happens inside you. The desire to return disappears. The need for their approval fades. The emotional chains that once held your attention begin to break. you begin to reclaim something extremely valuable, your independence of mind. And that independence is something a manipulative personality can never tolerate, because a person who understands their own worth cannot easily be controlled again. The dirtiest move, therefore, becomes the final revelation. It shows you exactly who they are when their power disappears. And once you see that truth clearly, you step into a new level of emotional maturity, one where your peace, your dignity, and your purpose are no longer negotiable. There comes a turning point in every emotionally manipulative relationship when the pattern suddenly stops working. For a long time, a narcissistic individual depends on a predictable cycle. They provoke, you react, they criticize, you defend, they withdraw affection, and you chase their approval. This cycle feeds their sense of control. It reassures them that they still have influence over your emotions and your decisions. But the moment you stop participating in that pattern, something begins to change. When you stop arguing, stop explaining yourself, and stop trying to prove your worth, you quietly remove the fuel that keeps their control alive. At first, they may not fully understand what is happening. They expect the usual response, the apology, the emotional reaction, the attempt to fix things. But when those responses don't come, a subtle shift takes place in the atmosphere of the relationship. What once felt like a power imbalance suddenly begins to equalize. This moment is critical because it represents the first stage of emotional independence. You begin to realize that the control they seem to have over your life was never absolute. It was sustained largely by your participation in their emotional games. Once that participation ends, their system of influence starts to weaken. When a narcissist senses that they are losing that influence, confusion is often the first reaction. They may start testing the situation, trying different behaviors to see what will trigger your old responses. Sometimes they become unusually charming. They may compliment you more than usual, offer apologies, or show sudden interest in repairing the relationship. To an untrained observer, it might look like genuine change. But in many cases, it is a calculated attempt to regain access to the emotional control they once had. Their goal is not necessarily transformation, but restoration of the previous dynamic. They want to confirm that they can still pull your emotional strings whenever they choose. If charm doesn't work, they might shift to irritation or criticism, hoping that anger will provoke you into reacting. The key lesson here is that manipulation often adapts when it encounters resistance. Just because the tactics change does not mean the underlying intention has changed. This is why awareness is so important. When you understand the pattern, you can observe it without being pulled back into it. Emotional maturity allows you to recognize that sudden kindness after long periods of disrespect may be a strategy rather than a breakthrough. Your calm response, your refusal to engage in unnecessary conflict, and your focus on maintaining boundaries all communicate one powerful message: you are no longer operating under the old rules. Eventually, when these attempts fail, the true character behind the manipulation begins to surface more clearly. For a long time, the narcissistic individual may have maintained a carefully constructed image. They might present themselves as supportive, misunderstood, or even self-sacrificing to others. But when their control begins to slip away, maintaining that image becomes more difficult. Frustration reveals attitudes and behaviors that were previously hidden behind charm or persuasion. This exposure can be shocking for people who have only seen the public version of the person. Suddenly, the patience disappears, the kindness fades, and the underlying need for dominance becomes more visible. This stage can be emotionally challenging because it forces you to confront a reality you may have tried to ignore before. The person you hoped would eventually understand you or treat you with respect may instead become increasingly hostile or dismissive. Yet there is also an important lesson hidden within this moment. Exposure brings clarity. When the mask falls away, you no longer have to spend your energy wondering whether the situation will improve if you just try harder. The truth becomes easier to see, and that clarity can become a powerful source of strength. The final stage often involves the most aggressive attempt to regain control. When direct influence over you is no longer possible, the narcissist may shift their focus outward. They may begin telling distorted stories about you, presenting themselves as the victim while portraying you as unreasonable or ungrateful. This tactic serves two purposes. First, it protects their public image by redirecting blame. Second, it attempts to isolate you by influencing how others perceive the situation. If people around you believe their narrative, they may unknowingly reinforce the narcissist's position. Understanding this tactic is important because it helps you avoid falling into another trap, the urge to defend yourself to everyone. While clarification may be necessary in certain situations, constantly trying to correct every rumor can drain your energy and keep you emotionally tied to the conflict. True stability comes from focusing on your own growth and maintaining your integrity over time. People who observe consistently respectful and balanced behavior will eventually notice the difference between accusations and reality. The most powerful response to manipulation is not endless argument, it is steady character. When you continue building a life defined by self-respect, emotional balance, and clear boundaries, the influence of those attacks gradually loses its strength. What once felt like the collapse of a relationship can ultimately become the beginning of a stronger and more self-directed life. When a narcissist realizes that their control over you is slipping away, something very strategic begins to unfold. For a long time, the relationship may have revolved around their ability to influence your emotions, your decisions, and even your perception of reality. Narcissistic individuals thrive on what psychologists often call emotional supply: attention, validation, and reactions. These elements are the fuel that keeps their sense of superiority alive. But the moment you stop providing that supply, the entire system they built begins to destabilize. At first, they may not fully understand what is happening. They sense distance, but they still believe they can regain control. However, deep inside, they start recognizing that the power dynamic has changed. When a person stops feeding the ego of a narcissist, the narcissist experiences something they are not accustomed to: loss of influence. This loss triggers a sequence of reactions. They might suddenly begin behaving in ways that appear surprising. A person who was once cold might become affectionate. Someone who never apologized might suddenly begin saying the words you waited years to hear. They might promise change, offer kindness, or act as if they have suddenly realized your value. To someone who does not understand narcissistic behavior, this can look like genuine transformation. But in many cases, it is simply an emergency response to regain lost control. The narcissist is not responding to love. They are responding to the fear of losing authority over your emotional world. If those tactics fail, confusion begins to turn into frustration. The narcissist expects emotional reactions because reactions are proof of influence. When you argue, defend yourself, or try to convince them to understand you, they interpret it as engagement. But when you become calm, emotionally distant, and clear in your boundaries, they lose their usual tools. Silence, emotional detachment, and firm decisions disrupt the entire manipulation system. This is when their behavior often becomes more extreme. What was once subtle manipulation may suddenly become obvious aggression. The mask that once made them appear charming or reasonable begins to slip, revealing attitudes that were hidden for a long time. Eventually, when the narcissist becomes convinced that they are truly losing you, they often resort to one of their most destructive strategies. Instead of trying to repair the relationship, they attempt to protect their image. Because their identity depends heavily on how others perceive them, they cannot accept being seen as the person who caused the breakdown. As a result, they may begin telling stories that reshape reality. They might portray themselves as the victim and describe you as the problem. Words you spoke may be taken out of context. Events may be distorted. Personal information you once shared in trust might suddenly become ammunition used against you. This is often referred to as a smear campaign, and it is designed to control the narrative even after they have lost control of you. For many people, this stage is the most painful because it feels deeply unfair. After enduring manipulation and emotional exhaustion, you may now face accusations or misunderstandings from others. But there is an important perspective to understand. When a narcissist launches these final attacks, it is often because they have recognized something powerful. They can no longer control you directly. The stories they spread are not evidence of your failure. They are evidence of your independence. They are a desperate attempt to preserve an image that is collapsing under the weight of truth. The most important response in this moment is not retaliation but clarity. When you understand the pattern, you realize that your energy is better spent protecting your peace rather than fighting every false narrative. People who truly know your character will eventually recognize consistency, integrity, and maturity. Over time, truth has a quiet way of revealing itself. Meanwhile, your focus must remain on rebuilding your emotional strength, reinforcing your boundaries, and reclaiming the parts of yourself that were diminished during the relationship. What appears to be the narcissist's dirtiest final move is actually a turning point in your personal development. It forces you to grow beyond the need for approval from someone who only valued control. It teaches you the importance of self-respect, emotional independence, and discernment in relationships. When you move forward with these lessons, the experience that once caused pain becomes a source of wisdom. And wisdom is something no manipulator can ever take away from you. One of the most misunderstood moments in dealing with a narcissistic individual is the moment they realize they are losing control over you. For a long time, the relationship may have operated under an invisible structure. They controlled the emotional environment, the narrative, and sometimes even the way you saw yourself. Their influence worked because your reactions fed their sense of importance and authority. But the moment you begin to reclaim your emotional independence, something begins to shift. The energy they once drew from you begins to disappear, and they sense that the system they built is starting to collapse. When a narcissist begins to realize you are done, their first reaction is usually disbelief. For years, they may have assumed that you would always return, always forgive, always explain yourself, and always try to repair the relationship. But suddenly your behavior changes. You stop reacting to every criticism. You stop defending yourself against every accusation. You stop seeking their approval. And when that happens, they begin to recognize that something fundamental has changed. The person they once controlled emotionally is no longer playing the same role. At this stage, many narcissists attempt what appears to be transformation. They may suddenly become kinder, more attentive, or more apologetic than they have ever been before. They may promise change, acknowledge mistakes, and express emotions that seemed absent for years. To an outside observer, it might look like genuine growth. But in many cases, this sudden shift is not about healing the relationship. It is about restoring control. They are attempting to pull you back into the emotional cycle where your attention and forgiveness become the fuel for their influence again. However, when they realize that even these tactics are no longer effective, the dynamic changes dramatically. This is the moment when the hidden side of their behavior begins to surface. The same person who once tried to appear charming, supportive, or caring may begin to reveal a completely different attitude. Frustration turns into hostility. Politeness turns into accusation. The mask that protected their public image begins to slip because the strategy that maintained their control has failed. What many people call the dirtiest final move often appears during this stage. If a narcissist can no longer control you directly, they may attempt to control the narrative around you. This can take the form of spreading distorted stories, presenting themselves as the victim, or portraying you as the cause of the conflict. They may tell others that you abandoned them, mistreated them, or suddenly changed without reason. The goal is not necessarily to tell the truth. The goal is to protect their image while weakening your credibility. This tactic is powerful because it shifts the battlefield. Instead of trying to pull you back emotionally, they attempt to influence how others see you. They understand that reputation can shape relationships, opportunities, and social support. By controlling the story, they hope to isolate you or pressure you into returning to the role you once played. But what they often fail to realize is that this strategy also reveals something important. It reveals the depth of their dependence on control rather than genuine connection. For the person who has finally decided to step away, this stage can be painful and confusing. You may feel the urge to defend yourself, explain every detail, or correct every false narrative. But growth requires a deeper understanding. True strength is not always demonstrated through constant explanation. Sometimes strength is demonstrated through clarity. When you know who you are and why you made your decision, you no longer feel compelled to prove your character to everyone who hears a distorted story. This does not mean silence is weakness. It means you choose your battles with wisdom. You protect your peace, maintain your dignity, and continue building a life that reflects your values. Over time, consistent character becomes stronger than temporary accusations. People who observe your actions long enough will begin to recognize the difference between truth and manipulation. What is important to remember is that this final stage is not the destruction of your freedom. In many ways, it is the confirmation of it. The intensity of the reaction often reflects how significant your independence has become. When someone loses the ability to control another person, they may fight harder than ever before to regain that influence. But their reaction does not define your identity or determine your future. The moment you refuse to return to a cycle that diminished your self-respect is the moment you begin building a stronger foundation for your life. The lessons learned from such experiences can sharpen your awareness, strengthen your boundaries, and deepen your understanding of healthy relationships. Instead of allowing the conflict to shape you negatively, you can allow it to develop wisdom. And wisdom is powerful, because once a person understands the dynamics of manipulation, and learns to protect their emotional independence, they become far more difficult to control again. They recognize patterns earlier, they value respect more deeply, and they understand that true relationships are built not on dominance or fear, but on mutual dignity, honesty, and growth. There comes a powerful moment in a person's life when they stop negotiating with what destroys them. For a long time, many people remain trapped in relationships where their emotions are constantly manipulated. They try to fix things, explain themselves, or prove their loyalty. But eventually, something changes inside. A realization begins to grow. No matter how much you give, the situation never truly improves. That realization is the beginning of awakening. When a narcissistic person begins to sense that awakening, they feel something that deeply unsettles them: loss of control. Their influence has always depended on your reactions, your emotional investment, and your willingness to keep trying. When that energy slowly disappears, they notice it immediately. Your silence becomes louder than your arguments. Your calmness becomes more threatening than your anger. At first, the narcissist may become confused. They are used to a predictable cycle. They provoke, you react. They deny, you explain. They withdraw, you chase. But when you stop participating in that pattern, the system breaks. The dynamic they relied upon no longer functions. This is when their behavior often becomes strangely inconsistent. One moment they may appear kind, apologetic, or unusually attentive. They might promise change, admit small mistakes, or suddenly show emotions they rarely displayed before. To someone unfamiliar with manipulation, this may look like genuine growth, but in many cases, it is not transformation, it is strategy. The narcissistic mind is not primarily focused on self-reflection, it is focused on regaining influence. When they sense you slipping away, they may attempt what psychologists often describe as hoovering, a tactic designed to pull someone back into the cycle. They use memories, emotional appeals, or sudden vulnerability to reopen the connection. However, if these attempts fail, something darker often emerges. When the narcissist realizes you are truly done, that you are no longer arguing, no longer explaining, and no longer trying to repair the relationship, they may reveal their most destructive tactic. Instead of repairing the relationship, they begin protecting their image. This is when the smear campaign often begins. Stories may appear that twist events. Conversations may be misrepresented. Private moments may suddenly be used as public weapons. They may present themselves as the injured party while quietly portraying you as the problem. To someone experiencing it for the first time, this stage can feel deeply confusing and painful. You may feel an urge to defend yourself, explain your side, or correct every false statement. But there is an important psychological truth here. People who are determined to misunderstand you rarely change their minds because of explanations. When someone is committed to controlling the narrative, facts alone rarely persuade them. This is why emotional strength becomes essential during this phase. Strength does not always mean confrontation. Sometimes strength means restraint. It means recognizing that your identity does not depend on every person's opinion of you. The moment you stop trying to control how others perceive you, you begin reclaiming something far more valuable: your peace. True freedom from manipulation does not come from winning every argument. It comes from stepping outside the cycle entirely. When you no longer react to provocation, no longer chase approval, and no longer fear their disapproval, the foundation of their influence collapses. That is why their final attempts often become more aggressive, not because you are weak, but because they are losing their ability to control the situation. Your calmness becomes evidence of your growth. Your silence becomes proof that their tactics no longer work. And eventually, something remarkable happens. The energy you once spent managing the relationship becomes available again for your own life. Your mind becomes clearer. Your confidence slowly rebuilds. Your decisions begin to reflect your values rather than someone else's expectations. This transformation is one of the most powerful shifts a person can experience. Because once you understand manipulation, you develop a new awareness. You begin to recognize unhealthy patterns earlier. You learn to establish boundaries without guilt. You realize that respect, honesty, and emotional safety are not luxuries. They are requirements. Most importantly, you discover that your worth was never dependent on the approval of someone who thrived on control. And when that realization settles deeply within you, something extraordinary happens. You stop shrinking to fit someone else's ego. You begin expanding into your own purpose, your own clarity, and your own dignity. What once felt like an ending becomes something else entirely. It becomes the beginning of your freedom. Many people spend years in relationships they do not fully understand. They believe the tension, confusion, and emotional exhaustion are normal parts of life. But what they are actually experiencing is a carefully maintained system of control. A narcissistic individual thrives on emotional influence. Their sense of importance is often sustained by the reactions of others. Attention, admiration, and validation become the fuel that keeps their sense of superiority alive. When someone constantly explains themselves, defends themselves, or seeks approval, the narcissist gains power. Not because they are truly strong, but because they have learned how to draw energy from the responses of others. However, something remarkable happens when a person begins to wake up. Awareness slowly replaces confusion. They begin to notice patterns, the blame that is always redirected, the apologies that never lead to change, the conversations that somehow end with them feeling guilty. This awakening is subtle at first, but eventually it leads to a powerful realization the cycle only survives if they keep participating in it. The turning point comes when the person stops feeding the system. They stop over-explaining. They stop reacting to provocations. They stop seeking validation from someone who has no intention of giving it honestly. In that moment, the balance of power shifts. The narcissist senses that something has changed. The reactions they relied on are disappearing, and with them, their control begins to weaken. At first, the narcissist may appear confused. They may attempt to restore the old dynamic by acting unusually kind or attentive. Promises may suddenly appear where there were once excuses. Apologies may emerge for behaviors that were denied for years. This phase often feels surprising because it seems like change. But in many cases, it is not transformation, it is strategy. The goal is not growth, but restoration of control. When these attempts fail and the narcissist realizes the person is truly done, the mask begins to slip. The patience disappears. The charm fades. The behavior becomes more aggressive, more manipulative, and sometimes more desperate. This is when their hidden character often reveals itself most clearly. The individual who once pretended to care deeply may suddenly show resentment, anger, or contempt. One of the most common final strategies is the attempt to control the narrative. If they cannot control the person anymore, they may attempt to control how others perceive that person. Stories may be distorted. Private conversations may be twisted into accusations. They may present themselves as misunderstood victims while portraying the other person as the source of every problem. This tactic is known as a smear campaign, and it is designed to isolate the individual and pressure them back into the relationship. At the same time, emotional traps may appear. There may be sudden emergencies, guilt-laden messages, or reminders of shared memories intended to awaken sympathy. The narcissist hopes that empathy will override clarity. But what many people eventually realize is that these moves are not signs of love, they are signs of fear. The narcissist is not fighting to restore the relationship. They are fighting to restore their control. Understanding this moment is important because it reframes the experience. What feels like an attack is often evidence of growth. The resistance appears precisely because the person has stopped cooperating with manipulation. In other words, the conflict is not proof that they made the wrong decision. It is often confirmation that they made the right one. Remaining firm during this stage requires emotional discipline. The instinct to defend oneself against every accusation can be strong, but constant defense often feeds the very drama the narcissist wants to create. Real strength is found in clarity. When a person knows their values, understands their boundaries, and recognizes manipulation, they no longer feel compelled to win every argument or correct every false story. This is where transformation begins. The experience that once caused confusion becomes a source of wisdom. The person learns to recognize red flags earlier. They develop healthier boundaries. They understand that respect cannot be negotiated with someone who only values control. Painful experiences often become powerful teachers. They reveal the difference between genuine connection and conditional approval. They teach that relationships should strengthen identity, not erode it. And perhaps most importantly, they show that self-respect must never be sacrificed simply to maintain peace with someone who thrives on chaos. Eventually, the storm settles. The noise fades. The accusations lose their power. What remains is something far more valuable than the relationship that was lost, a deeper understanding of personal worth. The individual who once doubted themselves now stands with greater clarity and strength. In the end, the moment a narcissist realizes you are truly done is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of a new chapter, one where your decisions are no longer shaped by manipulation, but guided by self-respect, wisdom, and the freedom to live authentically. And when a person reaches that level of clarity, no narcissist, no manipulator, no toxic system can hold them again. So if you are in that moment right now, where the manipulation has been exposed and the attacks have begun, understand this: you are not losing. You are graduating. The storm you are facing is not the destruction of your life. It is the construction of your freedom. And once you step into that freedom, your future will never again be controlled by someone else's ego. It will be guided by your purpose, your dignity, and your truth.